Love lost, lost legs, and bathroom breaks to die for. Pretty impossible living scenarios in my opinion. Oh, and what do you guys think gloves were made of back in the day? It's probably not what you think, so stay tuned to find out. Surgeries freak me out, as well as needles and dentists, but let's get back on track. Surgeries were a thing back in the 19th century, but not necessarily a good thing. I mean, obviously many people died from surgeries back then for a myriad of reasons. Lack of cleanliness among them. Surgeons rarely washed their hands or their operating tables. And also some of these so-called surgeons were actually barbers that were recruited during the war. Fun fact, the red and white poles you see outside barber shops are actually an homage to their work in the medical field, symbolizing the red-stained napkins barbers used during bloodletting. Chloroform was often used as an anesthetic in these procedures. Hot iron was used to stop patients from bleeding out, and leeches were used to extract internal fluids, and amputations were done without any chloroform or any other kind of anesthetic for that matter, in front of a crowd of people who cheered as limbs were removed and promptly dropped into a bucket of sawdust. Need I say more? Next up, red leather, human leather. That's right, way back when hoop skirts and corsets were all a rage, so was something else. Skin. Not showing yours, of course, that would be frowned upon in those times, but wearing someone else's was perfectly acceptable. Gloves, belts, and even shoes were routinely fashioned out of this material. The skin was taken from the bodies of the poor who were not claimed by any friends or family. The bodies were sent to medical schools where they were dissected and stripped of their skin, which was then sold to tanners and jewelers, and for a pretty high price point too, because it was pretty limited in supply. One man, a physician living in New South Wales, claimed that his human leather shoes were the softest thing he'd ever worn, and he also said that when he died, whoever had the desire to wear the shoes had his full permission, as he believed their comfort was something to be carried on even after his final breath. Wild, that's dedication. So guys, what's the grossest thing you've ever eaten? Well, it's probably not anywhere near as bad as the things people had to eat during the 19th century. The classic Victorian diet was composed of some pretty gross stuff, that is, if they even got to eat anything at all, which most of the impoverished members of the community didn't. For those who couldn't afford to feed their families, one incredibly popular dish served by housewives in the 19th century was brain cakes, which are kind of like burgers but also really not. Brains were washed and soaked in cold water before they were stripped of their skin and large fibers, then they were boiled before being mashed with egg yolk and seasoning and fried in butter. If you wanted to be fancy, the dish was finished off with a dusting of flour and some grated lemon, which honestly might be the worst part. I have never heard of using a flour dusting as a seasoning other than in like sourdoughs. They also ate cold gelatin coated chicken, bug infested bread that was hard as rock, and sometimes they would drink donkey milk directly from the source. I'm talking mouth to tit. So now that we've already lost our appetites, let's talk about the man who made life particularly impossible for the working women of the 19th century. Jack the Ripper, who despite killing at least 5 women, possibly 11, in Victorian-era London, has an identity that remains unknown. The name, Jack the Ripper, actually comes from a letter written by the assailant that was sent to local law enforcement. Jack had a habit of sending little souvenirs to the police, including, on multiple occasions, body parts, namely pieces of his victims' livers. He exclusively killed on weekends and bank holidays between 3 and 6 a.m., targeting women in their late 30s to early 40s. And what he did wasn't pretty. I mean, obviously he killed people, but the way in which he went about it was particularly gruesome. Jack the Ripper was known to forcibly restrict the airways of his victims, cut their throats, remove certain limbs and appendages, and cause extreme damage to the pelvic area. Oh, and his last known victim, Jack completely removed the surface of the abdomen and thighs of the woman along with their breasts and emptied the abdomen of all of its internal organs. That's disgusting. You know that phrase about beating a dead horse? Well, what about the phrase, honey, there's too many dead horses in the river? Oh, you haven't heard that one? Makes sense because I made it up, but honestly, it has probably been said before in the 19th century when there was way too many dead horses piling up in the Hudson River. And not just horses, cats, dogs, rats, cows, donkeys, and whatever else you can think of. In the Victorian era, it wasn't just humans who were dropping dead of disease, starvation, and careless killings. Animals often met the same fates too, and when this happened, contractors would go around collecting the carcasses and then dumping them into the lower bay of the Hudson, which resulted in a crap ton of dead animals washing up along the shores surrounding New York, creating some pretty gruesome sights and some pretty nasty smells. If someone asked me if I wanted to be part of an experiment, I might say maybe, but if they asked me back in the Victorian era, I would say you're out of your damn mind. Why? Because experiments back then were gross, super gross, and also highly unethical. And most of them were done without consent and by force, often in the name of medical advancements. In one case, a woman was suffering from a tumor, and so a doctor decided to cut out a piece of her skull in order to remove the tumor, and then replace it with a piece of a skull taken from a living animal. That is dumb. Another practice which was quite common was randomly injecting people with matter collected from animal glands, whatever that means. There was also an experiment done where doctors wanted to see if dogs could survive without using their stomach, and so they injected them under the skin with meat extracts. And all I have to say is thank God for modern day animal cruelty laws and ethics, because that's awful. That's gross. Okay, real quick, let's take a deep breath. Give me a big smile. No, this is not a mental health check, but rather how a crap ton of people died during the 19th century. This was due to a then incurable disease known as tetanus, which at the time was referred to as lockjaw. Why? Because those who were infected with the disease would experience seizures and extreme muscle spasms that would cause their faces to become stuck in a permanent grin, despite the fact that they were in incredible amounts of pain. The only release? You guessed it, sweet death. However, one doctor in Tours, France came up with a way to relieve the symptoms, nerve stretching, which today is just stretching, but back then was more like pulling and often resulted in the loss of limbs. That being said, one patient did report having a lessened sensation of pain caused by the disease, but they died a few hours later. So I think it's safe to say it didn't work. So the other day I was working and I spilled some tea on my thumb. It hurt, but it was nothing compared to these workplace-related injuries. Before safety standards and workplace regulations became a thing, mill workers often experienced way worse things than their hands getting slightly too hot. I'm talking about death. Like horrible, painful, gruesome death caused by massive pieces of machinery. You want examples? Well, I will give you examples, but they won't be pretty. In 1861, a woman in Wisconsin got her clothing stuck on a shaft while working in a flour mill, which caused her to get sucked into the machine, which caused her body to become horribly mangled, which caused her to lose her life. In 1892, a similar incident occurred. A man was working in a California paste factory when his hand became stuck in one of the machines. He was pulled into a grindstone and he was ground to death. So the next time you think your job sucks, remember these guys and know it could be much, much, much worse. I want you to know that while I think you are all drop dead gorgeous, you have absolutely nothing on the killer fashion of the 19th century. Like, they had it going on. I mean, if looks could kill. Oh wait, that's right, they did. And that's because my very favorite color, green, was very popular back in the Victorian era. But it wasn't envy causing people to drop dead out of nowhere, it was poison. That's right, the brilliant green, staple dye of the era, was actually chocked full of arsenic, and it wasn't just reserved for clothes either. This dye was used in wallpaper, bedding, tablecloths, and pretty much whatever else can be colored or dyed. And it affected pretty much everyone who could die. And they did. A lot. Thousands of people died as a result of arsenic poisoning. It was eventually taken off the market, but like too little, too late in my opinion. Holy shite, this last one is wild and maybe a little private too. Okay, so before the Victorian era came about, bathroom breaks were kind of communal. Like there was no private area a person could go to do their business, but Victorians loved their privacy and so they constructed the first bathroom, a separate room in the house specifically dedicated to relieving one's self. Before that, people were known to drop a deuce in bathtubs located in the living room, often in front of the fireplace. So you're probably thinking, this is cool, this is great, right? A private room for some private time. But just like Victorian looks could kill, so could Victorian bathrooms. There was no modern day plumbing, so toilets would become full of waste, which would lead to high methane concentration in the air. And then, well, all it took was a spark for the whole place to go up in flames. Talk about blowing up a bathroom. Gross. Alright you guys, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. It was super fun to do. Let me know if you want to see anything else. I've been your host, Hannah Thompson, and together we are keeping the past present.